Here we are, episode 2 of Community Mercs. If this happens to be your first time watching this series, please check out the first episode and the debut episode for more. The gist is that you guys come up with tank ideas from combinations of tank parts in the game, and I'll put them together and go over how I think they would perform. Let's get into it. We're starting off with a class and tier of tank that we don't yet have a Merc tank for, a tier 9 tank destroyer. A submission by our man Blakeski over in the Discord suggests a UDES 1516 hull with a Chivi's turret and the gun of an SU-122-54. He calls it the Warden. You might be thinking that the turret was an odd choice, and I thought so too, but it's got 380 base view range, which isn't terrible for a tier 9 tank destroyer. Sure, it's not the most, but it's passable, and definitely not the lowest. And it looks better than I thought it would. The gun of the SU-122-54 plays on a tank with 4 degrees of gun depression and a limited gun arc, but putting it in this turret gives it the ability to fully traverse, and with its extra headspace, it isn't out of the question to have more gun depression. Not by much, but maybe 5 to 6 degrees. But it obviously wouldn't end there, because it's got a hull that utilizes automatic hydropneumatic suspension, giving it an extra 4 degrees of gun depression. This tank takes a gun that's normally limited on a tank with no turret and minimal gun depression and removes those limitations. Now, if that wasn't enough, the chassis chosen here is from a tank with 318 meters of base steel concealment. That's not as good as the SU-122-54's base 294, but it's one of the best tier 10 mediums concealments, meaning you trade massive improvements to versatility of the gun for a little bit less concealment while still filling its role as a sneaky tank destroyer. I think this tank would perform quite well in its role, and I would love to see this one added to the game. Moving on, we have another tier 9 tank. This one was suggested by Dinoman in the comments of the last video. He chose the Skoda T50 hull with the AMX 5120's turret and the gun of the Type 61. It's named the Chipper. Right off the bat, you might notice that this tank is all one color. I dabbled this time around into some color matching, which I think really brings the tank together, whereas it looked like a mismatch before. This tier 9 medium would have a top speed of 50, 9 degrees of gun depression, and 390 meters base view range. Its gun has a pretty strong 258 standard pen and a quick base 6 rounds a minute with .36 accuracy. This gun is one of those hidden gems in my eyes. Many people move right past it and are even calling for a reforge of the Japanese medium line. However, if you've been paying close attention to buffs recently, the M46 patent got a really nice gun buff that made it a very strong vehicle, and yet this gun stacks up to it. They both share that base 6 rounds a minute, with a difference of 10 more base pen on the patent's gun, but the same heat pen. The Type 61 has better accuracy by .01, and their shell speeds are very comparable. This gun isn't anything to scoff at. It's a good choice, although it would probably like to remain on its native tank, seeing as the Type 61 gets 10 degrees as opposed to the Chipper's 9, and 410 meters base view range as opposed to 390 meters. It still doesn't take away from the cool factor of this tank. And all Merc tanks don't need to be home runs, right? We don't need more machines out there with more pros than cons. Last up, we have a tier 8 this time. Designed and made by Scrae, this tier 8 heavy uses the hull of the Barracuda, the turret of the HMH AMX M449, and the gun of the Nameless. They called it the Scrae. Now, that Barracuda hull wasn't part of the original idea, but I took a liberty in changing it as I thought the image they created showed a small turret and gun on a big chassis. So I went for a smaller chassis. Fitting with the idea that this would be a heavy tank, I went for another Swedish hull and chose the brightly colored Barracuda. But when I put it together, I felt it was wrong proportionally too. But at the same time, looked so odd and Merc-like that I figured this was something I could see being made. After all, look how weirdly proportioned something like the Slapjack is. With that aside, this tank would have a top speed of 45, 370 meters base view range, and a 300 alpha 88mm with 10 degrees of gun depression. The guns surprised me when they brought these tanks back out recently and I finally got my hands on them. So I think this bad boy would do well. It takes a gun that's on a tall tank that limits its capabilities and brings it down to a more low profile and agile playstyle. I think this tank would be a great addition to the roster. I just wonder if the gun would cause licensing issues somehow. That wraps up episode 2 of Community Merc Tanks. I absolutely love the ideas you guys are bringing to the table. I really enjoyed all 3 of these tanks this time around and look forward to making more of your ideas. Remember to leave them in the comments or in the Discord channel. See you in the next one.